pleasure to be here today as part of the continuing efforts to strengthen ties between Salt Lake Community College and the University of Utah. In particular, between the School of Business here and the College of Social and Behavioral Science at the University of Utah, which includes my department, which is the Department of Family and Consumer Studies. Within that department, we offer an emphasis in financial planning, which offers the courses that you need to become a financial planner, a certified financial planner. It's not the only thing you need to do. So to let you know a little bit more about that, Jenny Stout, who is one of our department's academic advisors, has a handout about that financial planning program. And when we're done, you'll have a chance to talk to Jenny. I'm also accompanied today by Dr. Kathleen Zick, who is the Associate Dean of our College of Social and Behavioral Science, and she's been here on a number of occasions because our college includes anthropology, economics, sociology, psychology, political science, and geography. Did I mention that twice? No, okay. So it spans multiple colleges here at SLIC. So you can also talk to Dr. Zick about any of our programs as well. So one of the takeaways for today is that even if you are interested in business, or if you're interested in business, you don't necessarily have to go to a business school to study topics that are relevant to business. Because that's what I've been doing for all of my career, is looking at the same topics that many would do in a business school. In fact, I've taught in a business school, but looking at it from the consumer's perspective, looking at the challenges that consumers face and how those can be overcome. And ultimately, that's what businesses do as well, right? They address consumer needs, and they're successful to the extent that they do that. So if you're thinking about going on to the University of Utah, the College of Business, that'd be great, but our college offers a number of majors, economics and our department, that are a lot cheaper than going to the business school and maybe just as relevant for you, perhaps more so. So I framed my presentation today in terms of the legal and political environment of business, because that's essentially what I study as a professor of consumer studies. And I'm going to focus on payday lending because that's a topic that I've done some research on in recent years, and it's got a nice local dimension to it as well. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt with your hand, and I'll be happy to address your concerns as we go along. So most of you probably know what a payday loan is or a payday lender is. We have a lot of them here in Utah. But essentially they offer high-cost, short-term loans, generally in the amount of $500 or less, that's typically due on the borrower's next payday. That's why it's called a payday loan. You write a check that's dated a week or two later from your checking account, and that's supposedly going to have the money then to pay for it out of your next payday. And if you don't, generally you will roll it over and take out another loan for another fee, and it gets pretty expensive pretty quickly. If you look at it from the point of view of interest rates or annual percentage rate, which is the common way loans are described, the interest rates can be in the 300 to 500% range, which is really expensive. And some payday lenders say that's irrelevant because if a person takes out the loan, say $300, and they pay us $30 at the end of 2 weeks, the APR doesn't really mean anything. It's really a fee. But because so many people can't pay off the loan at the end of the 2 weeks and then have to take out a new loan and a new loan and a new loan, then all of a sudden we're getting to a situation where the annual rate actually has relevance. So there's a long ongoing debate about whether payday lending is good or bad. And it really depends on your perspective. And it's really not a debate that I really want to get into. Some people say payday loans are a lifesaver. They give people who are desperate for cash short-term access to cash, which they can then pay back later. Other people describe payday lending more in terms of sharks and loan sharks in particular. So obviously, they don't like payday loans very much. And I like this picture just because it's one of those great chalk artists who are able to create that 3D effect. And also, it emphasizes the idea of the debt trap or debt hole. And that's how a lot of people who are working toward reform of payday lending see this industry as really a trap for people. But I just think it's great artwork too. So again, I'm not going to get into the issue of whether they're good or bad, because they can be good and they can be bad. The real the real villain in the story is poverty. It's the situation that makes people so desperate that they're willing to take out a loan that's the equivalent of 3 or 4 or 500% interest. So it isn't really the payday lenders are evil, even if you're against payday lending. The real evil is poverty, and that's obviously a much more complex issue. I was trained as a sociologist at the University of California, so I'm interested in how people organize to press their views of what makes for a better society. What leads to social movements? And in particular, in my case, I'm interested in the consumer movement, which in many people view as essentially a David versus Goliath battle, right? The consumer movement is the David. They don't have a whole lot of money. They don't have a whole lot of power. And they're up against some very powerful interests in society, generally businesses of various kinds, sometimes the government as well. So I'm interested in that. How does the little guy win? And so I've written a number of books about consumer movements. And here's just a couple of them. Some of them were already mentioned. So again, I wanted to make sure I plugged our department, not only as an alternative to business, just as a very interesting major in and of itself. We have a major called Consumer and Community Studies, and it focuses on what makes for healthy consumers as well as healthy communities. The name of our department again, and I've mentioned already that we offer the 6 courses that you need to become a certified financial planner. In addition to the courses, you have to pass an exam as well as have a certain number of years of experience. So those are quickly the courses you need. But in talking about payday lending today, I want to give you some historical context, give you the regulatory background of the industry, and then talk about the story here in Utah, and then draw some broader lessons. Yes, you can major in anything as long as you take these 6 classes, and we offer a certificate. Say you're an English major, you could take these 6 classes and become a certified financial planner. This class you can get credit for with classes here at SLIC. The remaining classes, these 5,000 level classes, you have to take at the U. So it could make it 5, it actually could be 5 classes that you would take. Okay, thanks for that question. Okay, so historical context. The payday lending industry essentially began in the 1980s. It experienced a lot of growth, especially during the 1990s, and that was true just as much in Utah as it was nationally. It's difficult to know exactly how many payday lenders there were in various years, because before 1999, they didn't have to register. Beginning in 1999, they had to register with the state, and so we have good data beginning in 1999. But before that, it's more difficult to estimate how many payday lenders and associated businesses like check cashers there were in Utah. So a professor at the University of Utah did some research on that by looking at yellow pages through various years and looking for advertisements for payday lenders and check cashers. And he came up with this chart. And you can see, even before registration was required in 1999, he was able to document the rise of payday lending in Utah by looking at the number of ads for these lenders in the phone book. Nice, innovative research approach. But beginning in 1999, the Department of Financial Institutions here in Utah required payday lenders to register, and therefore we have good numbers. And you have to be careful here. Initially, all they had was data on number of registrations, but if a store had 5 outlets, they didn't know that. So you were looking at the number of companies. More recently, they now have the number of outlets as well. But I'm going to show you data on number of companies. And then the definitions have changed. Sometimes check cashers were included, sometimes they weren't. Whether internet lenders were included, back in 1999, there were no internet payday lenders. So again, these numbers are a little bit tricky to compare from year to year, but I'm going to show you that. And you're going to see that non-internet based lenders peaked in Utah in the year 2005, And all payday lenders peaked in 2008, so that includes the internet lenders. And then there's been a gradual decline since around 2010, and that's mirrored a national trend. So in the last report, which came out in last year, the average amount of a payday loan was about $400. The fee range was between 0, which probably wasn't too common, and $27 for the loan. The average APR was 485%. And when Professor Peterson did his research on the Yellow Pages back in the year 2000, the average interest rate was 512, so it hasn't really come down very much. Loans paid in, the average amount of time to pay a loan was 31 days, so that's only one rollover. But for every loan that's paid off after 2 weeks, there's another loan that's paid off in 6 or 8 or 10 weeks. The number of loans reaching 10 weeks, and that's significant, in Utah in that last year was 45,000. Now, why is 10 weeks significant? Because lenders can't charge you interest beyond 10 weeks. That's due to a law that was passed a few years ago. The value of the loans reaching 10 weeks in Utah was $18.5 million, so a lot of people are reaching that maximum. And the number of lawsuits that had to be filed to collect was 3.35% of all loans, not 3.35 of these 45,000. So we do have pretty good data on Utah on the state of the payday industry. Now, as far as the regulatory landscape, we have layers. We have the federal, the state, and the local level. The primary regulator has been states, and that's been true in Utah as well. In some places, including Utah, cities have gotten involved, and very recently the federal government has attempted to set rules for the payday industry, and I'll say just a little bit about that. We have got local, state, and federal. So as I mentioned, the states have been the primary regulators, local governments, to the extent that they have not been prevented by states, because many states don't allow localities to regulate or narrow the ways in which they can regulate. And then, as I said, the federal government is poised, has been poised to act with respect to the payday lending industry, but with the change of administration, everything's come to a screeching halt. You can see here back in October, the headline was CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, finalizes its rule on payday lending, or payday traps. And this was a rule they had been working on for 6 years. But then in January, with a new head of the CFPB, Mick Mulvaney, the CFPB says it was going to reconsider the rule and has essentially put it on hold. And meanwhile, at the CFPB, they've become much more lenient with respect to payday lenders, including the dropping of several cases against individual payday lenders for deceptive practices. And there's a lot of controversy regarding this because Mick Mulvaney, when he was a congressman, was getting a lot of financial contributions from payday lenders. So it's unclear whether this is motivated by a sense that the case was inappropriate versus returning a favor. But I'm not going to get, that's a huge story. I could spend the rest of the time on that. As I mentioned, the states have been the primary regulators of payday lending, and there's been a large amount of variation in the extent to which payday lenders have been controlled. We have, on the one hand, very restrictive states, these dark brown ones, mostly in the east, but also in Arizona and Montana, where essentially these lenders aren't allowed. The restrictions on them are so strong that the industry says it's not worth it. At the other end of the extreme, we have the permissive states, and that's where Utah would fall. And in between, we have a few states that are, they call hybrid, that have some rules, some fairly strong rules, but not as strong as these most restrictive states. So there's a lot of variation by states. And this is a map of states that are basically the ones that are the most restrictive, and they call themselves Payday Freelandia, because you basically don't find payday lenders in those states. In some cases, the main technique for restricting them is to set an interest rate cap on them. So if the typical interest rate in Utah is 485% per year, and you have a state government that steps in and says the limit is going to be 36% interest, which sounds pretty high, right? But if you say 36% interest, it's not going to be financially feasible for a payday lender to operate, and so they will just close their doors. That's the main technique by which states become part of Freelandia. Coming back to the Utah part of this story, as I mentioned, in 1999 was the first time we had a state law with respect to payday lending, and it was relatively weak. It basically said if you're going to do business here as a payday lender, you got to register with the state. It didn't say you can only charge so much interest or you can only roll over the loans a certain amount of times. It just says tell us who you were. By 2010, the laws started to get stronger. In 2010, a law was passed that said you can't collect interest beyond 10 weeks, as I mentioned earlier. In 2016, the law said you have to check the borrower's ability to repay the loan. Now, you would think that you wouldn't need a law to tell a lender that you need to check whether the person can repay the loan. But the payday business model is essentially we don't care. Because if you pay us enough interest, that pays us back. That's enough for us to make money. And so we don't even want to know whether you can pay back the loan. And so they said, no, we don't want loans extended to people where we know going in that they can't repay it. That was Utah law. And also this, you had to give a person an interest-free extension of the loan before you could sue them. So 10 weeks, you can't stop, you can't charge any more interest, and then that has to be in existence. That period of interest-free payments has to be in existence before you can sue to collect. And then most recently in 2017, the law said that if you take out a payday loan, you get 24 hours to change your mind. Sometimes people go in, they get the loan, they're so desperate, and then they get home and they say, this was a really bad idea. And so the law says if you decide that within 24 hours, you get to go back and cancel the loan as though it didn't exist. And then this is a big one, a limit on people taking out a new loan after immediately closing another one. Because what do you do if you reach the 10-week limit, right? You know, and so the lender can't charge you any more interest, but you're not able to pay back the loan. You know that the lawsuit's coming down the pike. What do? You go to another payday lender, you take out a loan for the amount you owe, you pay off the first lender, and then you start another 10 weeks. And so the law said in 2017, can't do that. One thing we don't have are any limits on the fees or the interest that can be charged for a payday loan. The main state legislator who's been active in this area is Brad Daw, who's a Republican from Orem. And he's been the main anti-payday loan champion in Utah in the last few years. He began in 2011 by introducing a number of bills with respect to payday lending, none of which passed. But that was enough to tick off the payday lending industry. And so in 2012, they contributed a lot of money to unseat him. They took out anti-Brad Daw ads, deceptive ads, so that he would lose the election, and in fact he did. And a lot of this was facilitated by now disgraced Attorney General John Swallow. Here's an example of an ad that they took out against Brad Daw. Now, you know in Utah, President Obama is not the most popular person in the world, right? And Obamacare, right, not the most popular social program. So what do? You connect Brad Daw and Obama. They had no connection. Brad Daw was not only not in favor of Obamacare, he introduced some bills in Utah that went against Obamacare. But if you want to tar somebody, right, in Utah, you associate them with Obama and Obamacare. So these flyers were distributed with this money to unseat Brad Daw, and it was successful. But after 2012, John Swallow's connections to the payday industry came out. As I said, he was disgraced, he was indicted, and Brad Daw looked a little bit better, and in 2014 he was reelected, and then in 2016 and 2017 he introduced the bills that I already described to you. So that's basically an overview of the state. My research is focused on the local level, at the city level. And as I mentioned, cities can only act to the extent that state law allows. For example, the state of Utah says no local entity may set a restriction on the interest rate of a lender. If there's going to be a restriction, the state's going to do it. There's an exception to that, Texas, but we're not in Texas right now. So the local governments can only operate within the area that the state permits. And that's generally to use their power of zoning. Zoning is a local phenomenon, right? You don't talk about zoning for the state of Utah. You say West Valley City has zoning laws, Salt Lake City has zoning laws, Ogden, they all have their own zoning laws. And so that's how local governments can restrict payday lending. They can set a restriction on the density of them. They can say, we'll only allow, say, one payday lender for every 10,000 people in our city, or one for every 5,000, or one for every 25, but that's using zoning. Or we can set numerical caps. For example, the city of San Jose, which is a large city, said, we're not going to allow more than 39 payday lenders. How did they get that number? When they passed the law, that's how many there were in San Jose. They say, we're not going to allow any more than we have now. And if a company goes out of business, you know, there may be one that will come back in, but never any more than 39. Another technique of zoning is distance buffers. So for example, here's two different variants of it. One would be 1,000 feet between any two payday lenders. So that essentially limits how many there can be. Another one is no payday lenders within 1,000 feet of what? A church, a school, a residential neighborhood, any of the above. So again, those tend to restrict how many you're going to have. And then some zoning laws will also specify store features, like a warning sign in the store that talks about the dangers of getting in too deep with a payday lending. You can do that with zoning as well. So that's how local governments have operated. Two good examples in Utah are West Valley City. I'm going to say more about them. They were essentially the first in Utah in 2002, and they had a 600-foot separation between payday lenders. Is that very strict? No. No, why not? Yeah, 2 football fields, you could have a whole lot of them. But it was a start. It was a way to say we want to restrict them. And also, 1 per every 10,000 residents. That was more binding, right? That has a more grip, right? If you've got 100,000 people in the city, you can only have 10, no matter 600 feet. So that was the key part of their law. In 2009, and there were many cities in between, Salt Lake said stores can't be within a half a mile of each other. Now that's a lot stricter, right? That's not 600 feet, that's a half a mile. And so in Utah, the laws tended to get stricter over time, but West Valley was really the path breaker. And so I'll say a little bit more about that because I did a study where I compared payday lending at the local level, the restrictions on payday lending in Utah, California, and Texas. And it was based primarily on archival research as well as interviews with activists, journalists, city council members, and opponents, payday lending representatives of the payday lending industry. And we did 35 in-depth interviews. And this was funded by something called the Silicon Valley Community Foundation in California. The story in Utah focuses on 2 people named Peterson, both from West Valley City. One is Chris Peterson. Chris Peterson is a professor of law at the University of Utah. He was an undergraduate at Utah. He went to law school at Utah. You guys could do it too. When he was a senior in college, he needed money, and he's looking for a job, and he went to work for a payday lender in collections. And he was so turned off by what he found that when he went to law school, he dedicated his law career to working against payday lending. Now, that in itself would have probably resulted in a book and not really much action. However, Chris's mother, Margaret Peterson, was on the city council of West Valley City. And he said, Mom, these loans are really awful. You ought to do something about it. So he got his mom, and look, they look kind of alike, don't they? He got his mom to introduce an ordinance in West Valley City, the one that I described to you before, about the space, the distance limits and the number per 10,000, which passed in 2002. And the payday lending industry didn't fight very hard against this ordinance. It didn't see it as having much impact on their business. And so they did a little lobbying, but not much, and the ordinance passed as it was proposed relatively easily. But when West Valley City did it, what happened? Payday lenders would set up shop in neighboring cities, right? So you set up your shop right across the border in Taylorsville or South Salt Lake City. And so what did the city councils there do? They said, we don't want to be the dumping ground for payday lending. We know it makes our city look lousy to have all these payday lenders, right? It looks like we have a lot of poor people. We don't want them all over the place. So what did they do? What did they do?
Same thing.
Pardon me?
Same thing.
The same thing. They passed their own laws. And so West Valley City set off this cavalcade of anti-payday lending ordinances, including the one in Salt Lake City that I mentioned in 2009. And meanwhile, similar things were going on. People in Ogden, et cetera, were picking up on what West Valley City had done as well. So, having looked at Utah, California, and Texas, a number of themes emerged. One was the need for an inside champion. By inside, I mean inside the city council, right? It's tough to get the city council to take an issue seriously unless somebody inside of it becomes a champion for that issue. And that's true of any issue. In the case of West Valley City, we had the Petersons, especially Margaret Peterson. But in other Salt Lake City and other jurisdictions, for example, where's Joanne Sagini, the mayor? She just stepped down. Midvale? Anyway, yeah, Midvale. Anyway, she became an anti-payday lending advocate. And so you need somebody inside to kind of lead the charge, but that's not enough. You need some outside support. And in Utah, an organization called CORC, which is the Coalition of Religious Communities, which has members from all across the religious spectrum in Utah, they saw this as a moral issue, and they would show up at city council hearings and say, we support an ordinance to control payday lending. They would generally bring with them people who had taken out payday loans and had negative experiences, and they would tell their stories at the city council meetings. These would be powerful in and of themselves, but they would also tend to make the payday lenders less likely to want to get up and say, no, our products are great, right after this person said, this product drove me into bankruptcy. So borrower stories, very important in the political process here. Secondary effects argument. What do I mean by that? You would think that the main argument you would make against payday loans are these interest rates are ridiculous, right? They're usurious. How can you charge someone 400% or 500% interest on a loan? Well, if you're a religious organization, that's going to probably carry some weight for you because, you know, the concept of usury was ultimately a religious concept, the idea of excessive interest. But from the point of view of city leaders, that, you know, there are a lot of moral issues. There are a lot of things that pull on your heartstrings, right? So what was the argument that carried the day for them? It wasn't the primary effect of the loan on the borrower that convinced them to pass these ordinances. It was the secondary effect of having lenders in the community on the perception of your community, as well as crime, as well as blight. And so they turned it into an economic argument, not for the consumer of the payday loan, but for the community. That if you want your community like West Valley City to not be perceived as a poor area, you don't want to have a payday lender, and you don't want to have payday lenders because they bring crime in, they bring in the people not maintaining their buildings. And so it's an economic development tool to restrict payday lending. And that city leaders, that's the language they could understand. And then finally, the media, especially the newspapers in Salt Lake City, were very supportive of the activist efforts to reduce payday lending. And here's just one example. This is Bagley, who's a terrific cartoonist here for the Salt Lake Tribune. And here's an example of one of his cartoons where he's saying, you know, payday loans, bad news. And so the media are really important because otherwise, the campaign is always, you know, a small group working with city council, and if it's just at that level, the city council is generally going to hear from the businesses involved and say, well, we create jobs, we pay taxes, you don't want to restrict us. But once you bring the media in, then it becomes more of a public battle. And then it becomes more emotional, and then the city council leaders they feel more pressure to act. So activists can extract lessons from what was successful in getting these ordinances passed, but also there are lessons for businesses. And in Utah, the approach has been buy time with a slow surrender. Basically, you saw those different laws, and those aren't even all of them we have at the state level in Utah, is to say, okay, we're willing to compromise. We see some issues here. We're willing to make some small changes. And so that's happened over the course of more than 15 years in Utah. The industry has said, okay, we'll support some small changes at the state level. And we'll even support some changes at the local level as long as we're grandfathered in, right? As long as any new ordinance doesn't kick us out, we're okay with that. In fact, we actually like that. Why?
Because then they don't get as much competition.
Yeah, you can't bring any new competitors. So there's been this kind of soft surrender by the industry at the state and the local level, and it's probably a pretty smart approach. As I mentioned earlier, the payday lenders tend to lay low at city council hearings and try to lobby inside, behind the scenes, because anybody can make an appointment with a city council member, right? So you're not going to look good. You may even get booed at a city council meeting, but that doesn't mean you can't lobby, and you do. Avoid sleazy allies like John Swallow, who make your industry look bad because of your association with him. And be prepared for change. Payday lending has changed a lot since it began in the 1980s. Online lending, how does that work? Where's the lender based?
At their house, maybe?
Or out of their house? Yeah, but the house could be anywhere, right? Payday lenders can be based anywhere once you go on the internet. When they began in the 1980s, there was no internet. And so locally based companies like Cash City, they are competing now not just with other brick and mortar payday lenders, but also internet lenders. And then in just the last few years, you've got the emergence of the fintech industry. These are lenders, again, operating entirely over the internet, but with a different model than payday lenders of these high-cost, short-term loans. They may be offering loans for 6 months in installments. There's one company that starts you with a very high interest rate, and if you pay back your loan, they will offer you a new loan the next time at a lower interest rate. And if you pay that back, they'll offer you the next loan at a lower interest rate. There's another company that if you will take a consumer education course online before you take out the loan, they'll give you a lower interest rate than if you don't. So there are a whole lot of new companies that are coming in to fill this space because it can be very profitable. Even even Goldman Sachs has now got into this area of fintech, of trying to lend to people with not so great credit ratings, but with financial need. And so things are changed a lot for the payday industry. And you can see in this headline from just last December, 1 of every 4 Utah payday loan stores closed last year. Why? Because of this competition from the internet and the competition from these new types of lenders. So a final set of lessons, not for consumer activists, not for businesses per se, but for our society, is one, we need to offer better financial education. We need to help people use the money they have more wisely, and when they do get in tough situations, to make the best possible decisions. We need to develop better alternatives for people who are faced with either buying drugs for their kids or keeping the lights on in their home or paying their rent or fixing their car so they get to work, right? So that they don't have to go to a payday lender. So that there are other alternatives that are less expensive than paying 300%, 400%, 500% interest. And then ultimately, we have to work toward creating a situation where people face fewer emergency needs, where we give people, better pay, better jobs, et cetera. And that's obviously a gigantic agenda, which includes education. And so if we're going to really deal with the problems that payday loans tend to address, we need to look at these 3 things: better financial education, better alternatives for emergency situations, and fewer emergency situations. The question was, what kind of secondary effects, what kind of crime is associated with a payday lender and why? So there's, there's direct effects, right? Like there's just money that's going to be out there, right? And these stores themselves carry a lot of cash, right? But there's the indirect effects of a store being in an area and what that says about the area and the other kinds of businesses that tend to locate there, like liquor stores, right? Or massage parlors, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, the kinds of people who are hanging out in that neighborhood are the ones who are more likely to commit crimes. So it's not always a direct cause and effect. It's a more complex problem. But there's been studies that have looked at neighborhoods with payday lenders and without payday lenders, trying to hold constant other factors. And the ones with the payday lenders tend to have higher crime rates. And again, that's the kind of argument that speaks to a city council person. Who regulates the online lenders? That's a terrific question. And it's very, very hot right now. Some of them create partnerships with Native American tribes where they have no interest rate limits or whatever, and they operate out of Indian reservations. That's one way, so they're not regulated at all. Another method is you form an alliance with a bank that is regulated by the federal government, which has no regulations, right? And so even though you may be operating in a particular state, you have a relationship with, say, let's say you're a Utah company and you have a relationship with a bank in Delaware, which has no interest rate caps for any loans, right? And so that's technically who you're getting your loan from, this bank in Delaware, even though it's really the payday lender here. And that's another way to avoid regulation. So there is, there's this limited zoning at the local level. Some states are pretty tough. Some are more lenient, but there's no federal regulation at all, and there are lots of ways of getting around being regulated. What made me interested in payday loans? My interests for 40 years now have been in whatever consumer issue has been hot, whether it involved auto safety or trying to think of something non-financial, utility rates, financial, but not like loans. And payday loans became a big issue beginning in the 1990s, and people organized at the local and the state level to do something about them. The first state to regulate, the first states were Georgia and North Carolina, nowhere near here. But I noticed that, and that entered into my teaching. And then I became interested in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created as part of the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act of 2010. Hopefully you've heard of it. It's a hugely important law that was trying to deal with some of the causes of the financial crisis of 2008. And so the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created in 2010, and I wrote a book about how that happened. And then I was following the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and what are the issues that became priorities for them? Well, the first issue they got involved with was mortgage lending. That was essentially the main argument that people made about why we needed a CFPB, is to talk about all these mortgages that were issued from roughly around 2000 to 2007 that people didn't understand, loans where you didn't even have to pay back interest. As people got into this frenzy, that I've got to buy a house now or I'll never afford one, and housing prices are only going to go up, so it doesn't matter. And they took out adjustable rate loans that started off really low and then reset to levels they couldn't pay. So that was the first thing that the CFPB focused on. But the second thing they focused on was payday lending. Because for years, consumer advocates have been saying, federal government, you're not doing anything with respect to the CFPB. Look at with respect to payday loans, look at all the people whose lives have been negatively impacted by these loans. So I was interested to see what they were going to do. And in 2011, they started. They were brand new, and they said, we're going to hold hearings on the problem of payday loans and all around the country, take input. And as I mentioned, it took them 6 years to come up with a final rule, the end of 2017. And so I was watching what the CFPB was doing. And they actually wanted to study that. But I went to this foundation in California, and I said, would you like to fund a study of this? And they said, not really. What we're really interested in are the local laws. I said, okay, you want to pay me to do that study? I'd be happy to do it. So that's the honest answer. I was always interested in payday lending because it was included in my classes since the 1990s as an example of a consumer problem. But it wasn't until this foundation in California, which by the way gets its major donor is Mark Zuckerberg, because most of their activities take place in the Bay Area, which is where Facebook is located. But when they said to me, we're not interested in what the CFPB does, we're interested in what the local governments are doing because that's what we've been trying to push, I said, okay, I'll do that study. And they wanted me to do the study just in California, because that's where they operate. And I said, okay, I'd be happy to do that, but how much can we learn from one state? We need to be able to understand how it compares to other states. So I said, how about a state like Utah has been very active at the local level, but has a totally different political climate than California, right? Much more conservative. It's easy to understand why local governments in California would clamp down on payday lenders, right? But what about conservative Utah? I said, okay, I'll do that. And then I said, well, what about Texas? They're the one place where local governments can set interest rates. How'd you like to have a comparison of that? And they said, okay. And I stopped there, and that's how I ended up doing the study and how I learned about payday lending in Utah. Again, I'd always been following it through the newspapers, but I hadn't studied it. Long answer to your question. One of the things that makes me proud to be a Utahn is our state requires high school consumer education. And most of you have gone to high school here. Now, maybe it was a joke and you took it online, you didn't learn much about it, right? But not every state requires that. Utah, to its credit, has that law that says we need to provide some education in high school before people get in trouble later on in life. And there have been many studies of financial literacy in each individual state, not many, but several studies that have compared state by state, and Utah is always at or near the top in terms of financial knowledge. So that's very important. But even when you know what a payday loan is and how dangerous they are, they can be useful, no question about it, but they can also blow up in your face. You may be so desperate that it's your last resort. You've already asked your friends for a loan, they've said no. You don't perceive there's anywhere else to turn. And that's fine. It's good that payday lenders are there for that situation. But it's very rare that a person at the end of the 2 weeks is going to have enough money in their checking account to pay it off. And so the fee gets levied and a new loan is issued, and then they're paying again and again. And after 5 or so rollovers, you've paid as much in interest as you took out in the loan, and you haven't made a dent in the loan at all. So yes, education is part of the answer. Of course. Well, any business is going to try to go close to their the comment was that payday lenders know where their potential customers are. In fact, 10 years ago, there was a study in Utah of where are the most payday lenders. It wasn't in the western part of Salt Lake City. It was outside of Hill Air Force Base. We have a lot of people who don't have a lot of income, they don't have a lot of financial education, who make, they want to have a car, and then they get into trouble and they go to the payday lenders. And that's despite the fact that there are rules limiting the interest that payday lenders can charge to members of the military. That's despite that fact. So the comment was, you see that in anywhere in the country around military bases. These are kind of disconnected, other than the fact that in our department we address problems of low-income people and high-income people and everything in between. A CFP is going to serve someone with some assets. It doesn't have to be a lot of assets, right? In fact, a lot of CFP focus on young people, and then they get them as clients when they're young, and then as their assets grow, they help them, and then the payoff is when the person retires, and then they manage their income for the rest of their lives, right? So people who don't have enough money to save, CFPs can't help them, right? CFPs don't provide guidance on how to use your credit card. They're about how to protect the assets you have through insurance, how to build your assets by smart investing, how to spend down your assets in retirement in a way that your money won't run out before you die. That's what a certified financial planner does. There are other people, financial counselors, we have a program for that in our department as well, who tend to work with people who have very small amounts of assets or no assets at all. But the CFPs tend to focus on the side of the people, on those people who have assets and are interested in building significant amounts of assets. Because generally they're going to be paid in two ways. Some combination of commissions, which used to be the main way in which they were paid, and secondly, based on a percentage of the assets under management. And that's increasingly the way in which CFPs are paid. that if you have $1 million that you're investing with someone, they get 1% of that every year. That's $10,000. They have an incentive because if your assets grow, what happens to the amount of compensation they get? It goes up. It aligns your best interest as a client and their interests as a professional. Whereas a commission, generally you get that when you make the sale, and then you don't really care what happens after that. And so CFPs used to be primarily paid based on commission. Now they're primarily paid on assets under management. But again, there can be some combination of that. So the question is, if we know that payday lending is rooted in poverty, not necessarily the cause, right? But takes advantage of, why have we not seen more action at the federal level? That's a great question, because that's what the CFPB has been trying to do over the last few years. And I won't name names, but I called up one of our local congresspeople, and I said, you know, introduced myself and what I knew about the industry, and said, I think that what the CFPB is doing is great, because it was beginning to look like maybe the CFPB was going to back off. And the chief of staff of this congressperson said the congressperson does not believe in federal regulation of loans, that people should be able to make their own decisions about what's good for them. And so that's an ideological reason. You could maybe say it's based on campaign contributions or economic self-interest. I don't know that. But there are a lot of people who feel that the less regulation of financial transactions, the better, and don't want to see the federal government involved and want to leave it to the states and or the localities. I'm on the board of the Fair Credit Foundation, where we do send interns, and some people who work there now. So it's all interconnected. There are a lot of good opportunities for you.
All right, thank you very much.